Houston, we have a problem. Most of us, when we hear those words, think immediately of Apollo 13. This crew is out in space. There's a catastrophic failure. And immediately, hundreds of people here on Earth spring into action to try to bring the astronauts home. And really, when you think back to the reality that these people were working with technology that was nothing like what we have today. They were writing on windows and whiteboards and using calculators. And somehow they managed to bring those astronauts home in what could be described almost as miraculous. Now, when the astronauts first said, "Houston, we have a problem." By the way, did you know they didn't actually say that? They said something like, "Houston, we think we've had a problem," something to that effect, but it sounds better to say, "Houston, we have a problem." When the astronauts first said that, everyone could have just thrown up their hands and said, "Well, we got a problem, that's it, they're done, let's build a new spaceship." But they didn't, because what everybody in that moment understood, that the recognition of a problem is the first step towards a solution. You see, it's really easy for us sometimes to say, "Well, we've got a problem, just throw our hands up, we're done. No, there's no hope." But the reality is, in life, when you recognize a problem, that's really just the first step toward a solution. And we all have the same problem. We all have a problem, and this is what it is. This world is not what it should be. We've experienced this in many different ways. Some of you maybe in betrayal or a loss or a break of trust. Perhaps you've lost a friend or lost a dream. Maybe there's some deep disappointment. Maybe it's the fact that life didn't go as you thought it was going to go. Maybe it was a health diagnosis. We could go on down the list. There are so many ways in which we've experienced this, because this is part of what it means to be human. We've all at some point said, either out loud or in our heads, "This isn't the way it's supposed to be." Because the reality is, this world isn't what it's supposed to be. That is the problem we all share. And we're going to talk about that problem and talk about that solution today. And I want us to start in Mark chapter 8. We're going to kind of pick up almost where we left off last week as we talk about some of these remarkable sayings of Jesus. But Mark chapter 8, verse 38, it says this. This is Jesus talking. He says, "For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." Now, in this passage, Jesus addresses the problem that we all have. And he actually identifies the solution. And he talks us through the process by which we can resolve this problem. But let's start by talking about the problem, because Jesus names it here. He says, "Whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation." And when we understand what Jesus is doing here, it helps us understand why this world isn't what it's supposed to be. You see, Jesus is actually referencing the Old Testament. As he talks to his largely Jewish audience, he's using language they all understood. Remember, back then, every Jewish youngster grew up learning the Old Testament. They knew the Old Testament intimately. And so when Jesus particularly says adulterous generation, immediately their minds would go back, especially to the prophets. Because often in the prophets would refer to the Jewish people of that day, hundreds of years before Jesus, as an adulterous generation. Meaning this, they weren't faithful to God. One of the things that the prophets always decried was that the people had turned to false gods. They had turned to idols. They were worshiping the gods of the surrounding nations. And when they talked about this, they often referred to that as spiritual adultery, because the Jewish people had left their one true God, and they were no longer faithful. This language actually goes all the way back to Moses. Moses used this language talking about the people then. And so when Jesus says this generation is adulterous, that would have been a little offensive. Because the generation that Jesus lived in, they prided themselves on their faithfulness. They prided themselves on the fact that they didn't turn to other gods. They didn't worship false idols. They didn't worship the gods of the surrounding nation. They believed they were worshiping the one true God. And so when Jesus says to them, "This generation is adulterous," they might have gasped. What's he talking about? That was before. That was them in the past. That's not us. But he also says this sinful generation, again, borrowing from the Old Testament, when often the writers would call the generations of Jewish people sinful. So adulterous and sinful, Jesus is referring back in time, and what he's essentially saying to his listeners in that moment was, y'all are just like them. Because here's Jesus' point. Sin is sin, and it infects all of us. And since Adam and Eve, all of us have been adulterous and sinful. Because all of us have turned away from God. All of us have chosen at some point to do things our way. And so Jesus could just as easily stand here in this room today and say, this is an adulterous and sinful generation. And most of us would say, yep. Because we know we live in a world that has turned away from God. And here's the reality. The further we turn from God as a society, the worse things get. The reason this world isn't what it's supposed to be is because God's original plan isn't followed. And since Adam and Eve, none of us have experienced life the way it was meant to be lived. None of us have experienced the world the way it was created to be, because it is horribly and terribly broken by our sin. And so what Jesus is highlighting for us here when he says this adulterous and sinful generation is the idea that we all have a problem, and our problem is this: we have turned away from God. Right? Isaiah said, all we like sheep have gone our own way. And when we go our own way, things get bad. That's why Jesus elsewhere said there's a wide road and a narrow road, right? And there's only a few that are going the narrow road, but it's the narrow road that leads to life. Most are on the wide road, and the wide road leads to death. When we all walk the wide road together, life isn't what it's supposed to be. And so Jesus says, look, you live in an adulterous and sinful generation. This is why the world isn't what it's supposed to be. And he says there is this temptation that we all face because this is the world we live in, because this is our generation. There's a temptation that we all face to be ashamed of Jesus and his words. Because the majority is walking the wide road. And most of the time, most of us want to be with the majority. Most of the time, we want to feel like we fit in. We don't want to feel like we're the oddball. And so it's much easier to walk the wide road instead of the narrow road. And what Jesus says is, because you live in this world that is opposed to me, that is opposed to my words, it's easy for you to be ashamed of me. Now, most of us who are here, this is church, right? We're all about Jesus. So most of us here would say, hey, we're not rejecting Jesus. We're on the narrow road. So the reality is, for us, the temptation is actually not to reject Jesus, but to redefine Jesus. And this is what we like to do sometimes, is we like to remake Jesus in our own image. Oftentimes, when I think of who Jesus is, it's easy for me to just take the best version of myself and make that Jesus, right? So when I'm really at the top of my game, I'm loving, I'm kind, I'm merciful, I'm generous, I'm gracious, right? That's who Jesus is. The problem is we miss the whole picture. There's a lot of fake Jesuses that we make up, and most of these fake Jesuses, they have a little bit of reality to them. One of them is what I would call the mic drop Jesus. This is the Jesus we use to win arguments, right? Well, Jesus is on my side, so you must be wrong. I actually see this all the time on social media. Two Christians arguing back and forth about some issue, and then one of them will do the mic drop Jesus. Well, Jesus said this, so Jesus agrees with me, so you are wrong. The problem is if you worship the mic drop Jesus, if that's the only Jesus you know, you're probably an argumentative person. You're probably a spiteful, hateful person. You probably love to argue, and you probably have no idea what it means to be peaceful and joyful and gracious. And that's who Jesus is too. Jesus is not all about winning arguments. Some of us, maybe the Jesus that we subscribe to is more of the genie Jesus, right? You just make your wishes and Jesus makes them come true. You could also call this the Disney Jesus. When you wish upon a star, all your dreams will come true. And we have this idea that as long as I ask, then Jesus will provide. So Jesus will get me out of any problem I'm in. Jesus will give me anything I want. Jesus will do whatever I need because that's who Jesus is. And the problem is, if this is the Jesus you subscribe to, what do you do when Jesus doesn't give you what you want? And this is one of the reasons a lot of people walk away from Jesus. Is because they had this really small view of who he was, and they thought, Jesus is just here to make me happy. And if I'm not happy, it must be because Jesus is failing me, so I'm going to walk away from him. This is the problem we get in when we have a Jesus that's too small. And another Jesus I see sometimes, you could call him the Birkenstock Jesus, right? Or the hippie Jesus, right? Jesus is just all like peace and love, man. Right? No judgment. No law, none of that, no rules. Jesus is just peace and love. And this Jesus affirms everything, but never confronts anyone. And the problem with this version of Jesus is it has no answer for the problem of evil. And when we look around the world and we see that there is evil in this world, and it is breaking our world, and there are people who are hurting other people in our world, and Jesus would call that out, and Jesus would say, this is wrong, and this is evil, and this is what's wrong, and this is what I came to change. But if only Jesus is just peace, love, and acceptance, then he has no answer to the problem of evil. He's too small of a Jesus. There's one other kind of Jesus that I've seen. There's a lot of other ones, but maybe you're familiar with activist Jesus, right? Just come to tear down structures, right? Just going to tear everything down. This Jesus, though, is always fighting, right? There's always a cause. We're always going to get the big guy, always going to take down the authority. And there's a sense in which Jesus did that, right? Because he was always going up against the religious authorities when he was here. But there's so much more to Jesus than that. Because if you always have a cause to fight for, and you're always fighting something or someone, then you never get to experience the peace that he came to give us. He is the Prince of Peace. You never get to experience the joy that he came from. That's what the angel said when he was born, joy to the world, right? Jesus came to give us hope and peace and joy and calm and comfort and contentment. And if I'm always trying to fight something, I miss out on all of that. You see, the reality is, when I have to remake Jesus, it's probably because I'm ashamed of who Jesus really is. And Jesus warns us. He warns us. He says, look, don't be ashamed of me and my words. For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, listen to what he says next, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And what Jesus is doing here is he's tying this instructive piece to judgment. He's saying, when Jesus, he's talking about himself, when the Son of Man comes back with his holy angels. What is Jesus talking about here? When he says, when the Son of Man comes with his holy angels. Well, we have the answer in the Bible, right? We have the answer later. So if we scoot over to Revelation chapter 19, we see this. Then I saw heaven open. This is John writing. Then I saw heaven open, and behold, a white horse. The one sitting on it is called Faithful and True. That's Jesus, faithful and true. And in righteousness he judges and makes war. By the way, just a little piece of trivia. We're not doing a whole full study of Revelation today, but just earlier in Revelation in chapter 5, there's another rider on a white horse who does not judge in all righteousness, who's not a good guy. He's the Antichrist, the opposite of Jesus. But here, this rider is faithful and true. It's Jesus. Now look what it says about the rider. And the armies of heaven, arrayed in fine linen, white and pure, were following him on white horses. You remember what Mark said? In Mark, Jesus says, when the Son of Man returns with who? With his holy angels. What does Revelation say? Here comes the Son of Man, faithful and true, riding on a horse with the heavenly hosts with him. So when Jesus says, when the Son of Man comes, this is what he's talking about. So put it together. Don't be ashamed of me. Don't be ashamed of my words in this wicked and adulterous generation. Because if you are, when I come back, that's happening. When I come back, I'm going to be ashamed of you. That's what Jesus is saying. Now, if you stick in Revelation 19 just for a minute, there's a lot of good stuff there. You can scan through it. Basically, Jesus wins, okay? He defeats all of the armies of wickedness. He wins. He takes death and Hades and he throws them into the lake of fire. And then he takes Satan and he chains him up. There's a 1,000-year kingdom. It's great. Then Satan gets out. Jesus beats him again, of course. And then Jesus throws him into the lake of fire as well. So now all the bad guys are into the lake of fire, okay? So then we pick it up in chapter 20. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who was seated on it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found. This also is language from the Old Testament. This is describing the throne room of God. We see the throne room of God throughout the Old Testament. We see in places like Nahum and Job and Psalms this idea of nature fleeing away from God, nature trembling before God. So John's giving us this image of here is God, the righteous judge, sitting on his throne. And I saw the dead, great and small. That's just a simple way to say all of them, right? I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne. And the books were opened. And then another book was opened, which is the book of life. Hold on to that. We'll get back to it. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books according to what they had done. So try to picture this. The throne room of God. And all the dead, that's everybody, is standing before him. And there's these books. And I love books, so I imagine these massive stacks of books. I don't know what it is, but there's these books, and these books are open. And then it says that the dead were judged by what was written in the books, according to what they'd done. So everything you've done is written in one of these books. And the picture here is that at the final judgment, at the end of all things, after Jesus wins, these books are going to be opened and everything you have done is in these books. This is bad news, right? Because all of us would say there's some things in those books that I'd rather that stays closed. And there's some things in those books that I've done that I'm pretty sure God would disapprove of. And if I'm going to be judged based on what's in those books, then I am in big trouble, and so are you. Well, fortunately, that's not the end of the story. So we keep reading into verse 13, and the sea gave up the dead who were in it. So it's just like this comprehensive picture, everybody who's ever died. Death and Hades, that's the grave, gave up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one of them, according to what they had done. So John's kind of restating what he just said. Everybody gets judged based on what they've done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. I want you to think about what that means. When death and Hades, that's the grave, get thrown into the lake of fire, that means there is no more death. Anybody who makes it past this lives forever. Because death is gone, never again to rear its ugly head. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, that's the second time we've seen that phrase, he was thrown into the lake of fire. So, if death and Hades are already in the lake of fire, to be thrown into the lake of fire means eternal death. Now, if you go back to Matthew 25, we'll just take a quick second. Jesus actually says about the lake of fire that it was created for Satan and his angels. It wasn't actually created for us, but those of us who choose to reject God will go there and will suffer eternal torment separated from him, eternally dying, because that's where death and Hades are. And you go there, notice this, not because of what you've done, but based on whether or not your name is in the book of life. So this raises two really important questions that we have to know the answer to. Right? Question number one, what is the book of life? Question number two, is my name in it? Right? I have to know that because that is the question of all of the ages. What is the book of life, and is my name in that book? Let's talk about what the book of life is, because it's not something that's just talked about in Revelation. In fact, we can go all the way back to Psalm chapter 69. David writes this. He's talking about his enemies and the people who are the enemies of God. And he says, may they be blotted out of the book of life. So David's got this idea of a book of life and not be listed with the righteous. So David has this idea of the book of life. It's not his idea. He's inspired by the Spirit here when he's writing this, but this is something that's already been seen in Exodus. Moses has a conversation with God about the book of life. Later on, Daniel, in Daniel chapter 12, Daniel writes about the book of life and says, all whose name is in the book of life will be delivered. So this idea that we see in Revelation, it's been building through the whole of Scripture till we get to Revelation. That everybody's talking about this book of life, this book of life, this book of life. Paul, the apostle, understood this. Philippians chapter 4, verse 3, he says, here, just context, he's talking to the Philippian church about trying to help these two women, Euodia and Syntyche, get along because they're having this big fight. It's affecting the whole church. And so he's trying to get them to get along. And he says, yes, I ask you also, true companion, help these women who have labored side by side with me in the gospel together with Clement and the rest of my fellow workers whose names are in the book of life. And so Paul says, look, all of you guys, all of you who are part of this mission that we're on, that are part of this church, your names are in the book of life. Euodia and Syntyche, their names are in the book of life. My name is in the book of life. Paul understands there's this book. It's called the book of life. And if you're in the book of life, as Daniel said, as Revelation says, as Jesus says, then you will be delivered from eternal death. Revelation 21, another place that talks about the book of life, says this, but nothing unclean will ever enter it. So it's talking about heaven, right? The eternity with God in the presence of him. Nothing unclean will ever enter it, nor anyone who does what is detestable or false, but only those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. So grasp this. At that final judgment, the books are open. Everything we do is on display. But there's also this other book, this book of life. And it's this book of life that holds the words of life, which essentially is this: if your name is in it, all that other stuff doesn't matter. Because notice it says here that those who do what is detestable or false are not there. But those who are written in the book of life, they get eternal life. So it's not about what we do, it's about whether or not our name is written in this book. And there's a really important word in this verse that helps us understand the book of life, and it's who is the owner of the book of life. It's the Lamb. Do you see that? Those who are written in the Lamb's book of life. The book of life belongs to Jesus. And it's Jesus who writes our names in the book. And that's really important, because I'm not good enough to write my name in the book of life. And you're not good enough either. Think about it this way. If we were to write our own names in the book of life, we would have to do it with pencil. Right? So I helped a little old lady across the street today so I can write my name in the book of life because I did something good. And then later in the day, I got really mad at my dog and I lost my temper, so I got to erase my name from the book of life. But then later, I spent a little bit of time in prayer so I can put my name back in the book of life. But later, I thought some bad thoughts about some people that had said some nasty things to me, so got to erase my name from the book of life. Do you see how this goes? If it's up to me, it's this constant writing and erasing, because I'm not good enough. And the reality is, if I was writing my name and erasing my name from the book of life, that my spot in the book, it wouldn't just be like that eraser smear that you get. Like we'd have worn a hole in the book from so much erasing. I need someone to write my name for me in ink that cannot be erased. And that's Jesus. You see, this is the beautiful thing, that Jesus never did anything wrong. Jesus never needs to erase anything. And Jesus writes my name in the ink of his blood. Because when he went to the cross, he paid for all of my erasing, which means he erased all of my erasing. And so he can write my name without fear. It will never need to be erased because he did it for me and he keeps it for me. And so if Jesus writes my name in the book of life, it is there and it will stay there and it will never go away. And when I find myself at the final judgment, I don't have to worry about what's written in those books because I know the only thing that matters is my name is in the Lamb's book of life. So let's keep going. Revelation 3:5. The one who conquers, this is Jesus talking, the one who conquers will be clothed thus in white garments. Listen to what Jesus says. And I will never blot his name out of the book of life. This is what Jesus does for us. And then he says this, I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Does this sound familiar? So Jesus says, look, if your name is in the book, then I will confess your name before my Father and the angels. Now remember where we started. Can we go back to Mark 8? I want you to see how Mark 8 is almost the identical words. Jesus says, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father. So what Jesus is saying here is if you're ashamed of me, I will not speak for you on that day. If you reject me, I will not be your advocate on that day. But the reverse is also true, as we've seen in Revelation and everywhere else that we've looked this morning, that if I am not ashamed of Jesus, if I conquer, if I receive him, if I accept his amazing free gift of salvation, then he will speak up for me on that day. You see, here's the reality. At the end of all things, you will stand before God, the righteous judge. And Jesus will be there with you. And he will either be the prosecuting attorney or he will be your defense attorney. And if Jesus is your defense attorney, you will never lose. So understand this. We must answer this one question. Right? I do not want you to leave this morning without answering this question. Is my name in that book? Is my name in that book? You can have full assurance that your name is in that book. You don't have to go through life afraid and fearful of final judgment. And the whole reason we're talking this through this morning is because I don't want you to be fearful. I don't want you to have anxiety. I don't want you to fear death. You see, the amazing thing is that for followers of Jesus, we do not fear death. Now, we don't chase it, but we also know when that day comes, it's just simply me stepping from this life into the next life, where I will spend eternity with my Creator, with my loving Heavenly Father because of what Jesus did for me. And you can have that confidence if you know that your name is in that book. Go back to Revelation 3:5, what Jesus says. The one who conquers, I will never blot his name out. You can be confident that Jesus will never blot your name out if you will give your life to him. If you will give your life to him, he will give his life to you. If you will choose to follow him all of your life, when your life ends, he will be waiting for you and he will welcome you and he will speak up for you. If you choose not to be ashamed of him in this life, then he will not be ashamed of you in the next life. I know that for many of you, this is old stuff. This is simple stuff. And I would ask for you that you'd spend today being grateful for what Jesus has done for you. That he was willing to go to the cross to pay the price so that he could write your name in the book of life. And I would ask if that's you this morning that you right now begin to pray. Because there are some of us here today that don't know. There are some of you who are here sitting here right now and you're not sure if your name is in that book. And I want to invite you this morning to have that confidence. You see, if you're willing to acknowledge your sin to God, if you're willing to say to him, God, I've not always done things my way, your way. Sometimes I've done it my way. My life isn't working. I'm not experiencing life the way you want it to be, and I need to change. And if you're willing to accept what Jesus has done for you, to place your faith in him, to believe in his sacrifice, that he alone is the one that can write your name into the book. If you will receive that, there's this amazing trade that happens. You see, I take my broken, sinful, messed up life and I give it to Jesus. And in return, he credits me with his perfect, righteous, holy life. And so that when God the Father looks at me, he doesn't see my sin. He doesn't see my brokenness. He doesn't see that I've fallen short over and over again. He sees instead Jesus. He sees me covered by the blood of Jesus. And because he sees me as Jesus, he sees me as holy and as righteous. And he adopts me as his child. And he reserves a place for me in eternity. And you can have confidence in that this morning. Normally when we get to the end of the sermon, I pray. I'm going to invite some of you to join me in that prayer today. You don't have to do it out loud, but I'm going to put the words of the prayer up on the screen. And as I pray these words, if this is you this morning, if you need the confidence of knowing that Jesus has written your name in the book, pray these words with me. Pray them in your heart, pray them in your mind. And the rest of you just pray a prayer of gratitude as I pray. But let's go to prayer. Jesus, I want to align my life with yours. I acknowledge my sin and I receive your forgiveness. Just as you died for me, I am dying to my old life. And just as you rose for me, I am claiming a whole new life that you have given me. I am not ashamed of you. I will follow you forever. Thank you for saving me. Amen.